friends, welcome to Nerdy Bitz. TLDL, too long, didn't listen. I'm your host, the Reverend Tracy, and this is where we take a brief but deeper dive into the psychology, neuroscience, and cultural concepts underneath this week's main episode. Now, if you've been listening to our fatherhood episodes, you may remember a particularly nerdy vocabulary word that tripped up both Tim and I at first, alexithymia. And while we touched on it briefly in the main shows, today I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about a related concept called normative male alexithymia. Specifically, how it starts, how it sticks around, what you can do if you think it applies to you, and what the rest of us can do to help break the cycle in our culture. Because this is one of those topics where I think a little understanding can go a long way. So let's start with the researcher behind the concept. Psychologist Ronald Levant proposed the idea of normative male alexithymia as a way of understanding how many boys are socialized around emotions. Now, before we go any further, let's be clear about something. Alexithymia itself is not a male condition. Women can experience it, men can experience it, non-binary folks can experience it. Anybody can. What we're talking about today is a specific theory proposed by Ronald Levant. The idea is that many boys have historically been socialized in a way that make emotional literacy harder to develop. So while the pathway we're discussing today may be especially common among men, the skills we'll talk about building apply to everybody because emotional literacy is a skill. And skills generally don't develop by accident. They develop through teaching, practice, modeling, feedback, and repetition. Think about it this way. Nobody expects a child to become fluent in Spanish if nobody ever teaches them Spanish. Nobody expects a child to know how to ride a bike if they are never allowed to touch a bike. But when it comes to emotional skills, we sometimes act like people should magically know how to identify and communicate complicated internal experiences without ever being taught how. And that's where this gets interesting, because many boys receive messages early in life that emotions are something to suppress rather than understand. Maybe it's man up. Maybe it's walk it off. Or my personal favorite, because I heard the girl version of this, big boys don't cry. Maybe it's simply growing up in a household where nobody talked openly about feelings. Whatever the source, the lesson is often the same. Certain emotions are acceptable, others are not. And over time, that shapes behavior. Now, let's add a little neuroscience to this spicy mix. One of the remarkable things about the brain is that it becomes more efficient in things we practice repeatedly. Neural pathways strengthen through use. The brain is constantly looking for ways to automate patterns that get repeated over and over again. So if a child repeatedly practices identifying emotions, naming emotions, discussing emotions, and receiving support around those emotions, those skills become stronger. But on the other side of the pendulum, if a child repeatedly practices suppressing emotions, avoiding emotions, rerouting to emotions that are allowed, or disconnecting from emotions altogether, those habits can become more automated as well. Not because the brain is broken, but because the brain is doing exactly what brains do. It's adapting to the environment it's given. And that brings us to something I think is really important. The research on alexithymia is not saying that people with alexithymic traits don't have emotions. That's a common misunderstanding. That is how you get people labeling folks as narcissists, but really aren't. The issue isn't feeling less. The issue is often having more difficulty identifying, labeling, understanding, or communicating those feelings to even begin to act on them properly. And as you can probably imagine, that creates challenges in relationships, parenting, conflict resolution, mental health, friendships, and even in understanding yourself. Because it's hard to communicate what you don't have words for. It's hard to ask for help when you can't clearly identify what's wrong in the first place. And it's hard to teach emotional skills to your children if nobody ever taught them to you. Now, I think this is where conversations about men can sometimes go off the rails because there's a tendency to turn every discussion into either blame or excuses. And frankly, I don't think either one is particularly helpful. Understanding where a deficit comes from is not the same thing as saying the deficit doesn't matter. Yes, adults are still responsible for how they treat others. Adults are still responsible for growth. And adults are still responsible for learning. But we also cannot spend generations emotionally undertraining boys and then act shocked when some men struggle with emotional fluency later in life. That's not accountability. That's just confusion. And honestly, shame is usually a terrible teacher. There are studies, feel free to Google them. If someone was never properly taught a skill, humiliation rarely helps them learn it. Compassion tends to work a lot better, no matter how old that person is. And honestly, whether you identify as a man, a woman, or anything else, if you've ever found yourself thinking things like, I know I'm feeling something, but I don't know what, or I know something is wrong, but I can't quite put my finger on it, then some of what we're talking about today may feel familiar because emotional literacy isn't a men's issue. It's a human issue. It's an American culture issue. And the good news is that it is a learnable skill. So, what do we do with that? Well, first, I think we stop treating emotional literacy like some magical personality trait people either have or don't have. It's a skill, and skills can be developed. Second, I think we become more intentional about how we raise our boys because emotional suppression may protect boys socially in childhood while quietly limiting communication skills they'll need later in life as men, partners, fathers, friends, and leaders. And third, if you're listening to this and some of this sounds familiar, I'd encourage you to become curious about something called emotional intelligence, or shortened as EQ. Not because you need to become some perfectly emotionally enlightened human being, but because emotional intelligence is really just a collection of skills. Skills that help us understand ourselves, skills that help us communicate with others, skills that make relationships healthier. And the beautiful thing about skills is that they can be learned. Whether you're 16, 36, or 76, one place to start is simply expanding your emotional vocabulary. If every feeling gets translated into, I'm fine, I'm just stressed, or I'm pissed off, it might be time for a bigger emotional dictionary. Try getting more specific. Maybe you're frustrated, disappointed, embarrassed, lonely, overwhelmed, anxious, ashamed, resentful. The more precisely we can name emotions, the easier they become to understand. Another great tool is journaling. And before anybody rolls their eyes, remember that journaling isn't necessarily writing poetry by candlelight. Sometimes it's just asking yourself, what did I do today? How did those things make me feel? What am I feeling now that I'm sitting away from the situations? And then honestly trying to answer. You might also check out books like Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman or Permission to Feel by Mark Brackett, both of which explore emotional awareness and emotional skills in practical, approachable ways. And for the rest of us, I think it's time we stop turning emotional growth into a shame contest. Maybe instead of mocking vulnerability, we normalize emotional language. Maybe instead of pointing fingers, we start teaching. Maybe instead of only criticizing deficits, we create environments where people can safely learn. Because what sticks with me about normative male alexithymia is that it reminds me how often we confuse skill deficit with character flaw. Sometimes people aren't refusing to communicate. Sometimes they genuinely don't have the vocabulary yet. And that's a very different problem, one that can actually be solved. You cannot fluently speak an emotional language nobody taught you, but that doesn't mean you can't learn it. And it doesn't mean we can't do a better job at teaching it to the next generation. Stop blaming, start learning. Have some compassion, find some healing. And that's your Nerdy Bitz. Sometimes growth doesn't start with fixing what's broken. Sometimes it starts with learning what was never taught.
Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy
on YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Bye, friends.